Welcome back to Gig Harbor Paddling. Today we're going to be talking about how to get to the catch. For kayakers, I've noticed a trend on the water of when they get to the catch, they do that by either lowering their hands or breaking at the back. And for canoeists, in a similar fashion, they're breaking at the back to get to the catch, right? And they're breaking that chain of power. So we talked today about getting your top hand down and dropping that top hand for the kayakers and keeping that chain of power for both of them. A setup is how you set up your stroke. So it is that period right before you hit the water, right? Where both arms should be straight and your hips should be all the way positive and rotated forward to prepare you for pulling. Here's our setup, right there, okay? Now how we get to the catch, right? Ideally is that we just fully rotated and then we let our chest fall, right? Maintaining our A-frame. When I go frame by frame from your setup to your catch, what's the first thing that moves? Your back. Who said back? Henry? Right. So when we see how we're getting from your setup to your catch, what we're seeing is that we're breaking at the back. So when we're rotating, Johanna, what I see a lot is we get into our setup and it looks pretty good, right? We could be rotating a little bit more, okay, and our arms could be a little straighter, but our setup looks all right. What's the problem is when we get to our catch, instead of keeping that rotation and just dropping that chest, what we're doing is we're breaking at the back, and that's how we lower our paddle to the water. So that specific moment is what we're going to be talking about for both canoeists and kayakers, okay? I think it's really easy to spot on canoeists. Set up, hip is forward, it's engaged, okay? And then the back goes back. Here we're at neutral, and we've barely buried our blade. When we watch Emma, right, we see that her hip remains forward through her catch. I think she's a really good example of someone I like watching when I think of that setup to the catch, right? And I'm only focusing on that period from your setup to the catch. So see how her hips remain forward and engaged until fully buried, and then they pull back. We can see when we're breaking at that back, especially from the back view, right? We see as she's going into her setup and going into that catch, that breaking of the back, right? And so we might often say as a coach, keep your hip in the boat. We see that disconnection between that hip and that arm by that breaking of the back. So back views are really nice for this because we can see exactly where his hip breaks. But we see right at that catch, the hip pops out, and that's how we're getting from our setup to our catch. Instead of keeping that hip out of the boat and getting to our catch by popping it out, what we have to do is we have to move our hips under our shoulders and be rotating from that hip, right? And as we rotate, we're gonna catch with that hip still falling and rotating, right? Instead of, right, coming to break at the back and get to the catch this way. Okay, kayakers do this in the same way. When we see how we're getting from that setup to that catch, his arms average out. So when I talk about kayakers' arms averaging out, it's when kayakers do this thing where they're like, okay, my front arm needs to be 180 degrees, my back arm needs to be 90, so my brain will make them both wrong. And you guys paddle like this, okay? Because it's kind of like 90, and it's kind of like 180, right? But it's a lot easier to memorize. So we kind of paddle open. And you see it, especially with new paddlers, and especially in sprints for you older athletes. It's hard to get into that setup all the way. So what we do is we kind of shorten the pathway to get there, right? But that's not a powerful position. Leg drive isn't as connected to the upper body. Remember how last week we talked about if there's a kink in the chain of power, power just leaks out from that leak, right? And so instead of having that straight arm and we have that bent arm, suddenly we're using our tricep and our bicep way more than we were using our back. And we've talked about having to keep that arm straight because when we start bent, we're pulling, okay? The other thing is it just limits our reach, right? When we're averaging that arm, I could get way more reach if I just reached. We're hitting that setup, but then suddenly, we've done the averaging, right? Where instead of that hand, that back arm staying back, and pulling through to get to that midline of the boat, we're seeing that it shoots up, right? And that's where we get those averaging in the middle, where the arm shoots up and we exit with those straight arms. Once that back arm moves up, then that front arm is moving, right? We see that, and his setup is here, that back arm moves, then that front arm moves down, okay? But by the time we're buried, we have straight arms. So that backhand might not be coming up all the way. When we're unstable, we want to be low. Now, sometimes this comes up and we're not unstable, right? He looks pretty stable in this boat. So it could just be that we were stable, we made the habit. Now we're pretty stable, we're still having that habit. I see that his knees are rotated. In Sirskis, it's really hard to get that full rotation. But his knees look like we're rotating. The setup looks tall. And then we're gonna go right into that catch. I do see how that hip especially starts rotating backwards before it's time, and we're seeing a setup here, okay? It's level, it's beautiful, and then we hit our catch. What moves first? That hip maybe a little bit. What about his arms? From that setup to the catch. The top arm?
Back arm pushes up.
Yeah, so we see it's kind of similar to Will. The first thing that moves is that back arm, right? But instead of Will keeping punching up, I do see that it's coming across, right? So while we might be getting to our catch with that back arm shooting up, I do still see that in his pull, it is bent, which shows me that we have not lost all connection within that pull, right? I do want to see us correct that to get to the catch, we do not raise the backhand and drop the front hand. All we have to do is drop that front hand and then press down and across. When we're seesawing our paddle, and I see it in all 4 of you that are in this video, okay? Even if you can't see the other 2, right? It's when we're going into our setup, right? And then instead of exiting, hitting that setup, and then pulling, what we're doing instead is we're exiting and then coming right into our catch. We've skipped an entire phase of the stroke. There's only 4, so that's 25%, right? It's not a good number, right? So we're exiting and then we're catching, okay? And that creates a seesaw of up and down. Not quite side to side. You will see maybe some side to side kind of like wobble. Maybe that's what you're talking about. Yeah. I wouldn't classify that as seesawing, but you might see that back and forth when you seesaw. What I'm seeing is that they're not super stable, so the moment they exit, right, they want to get into the water again, because the water is safe. When I see their exit, especially Haley, right, I see the moment you exit, you want to get right back in that water. So see how
I was rushing her too.
You were rushing, but why, right? When we're talking about rushing in a K2, we have to be wary of just saying, Haley, go slower. We're fully buried, and both arms are straight, Haley. Yeah. Right? Whereas I look at Carolyn, and it's hard to see that back arm though, it does look like there's still some power left, right? So Carolyn, that's good. And I would just work Haley on keeping that back arm out, which we know, we've done that. So we talk a lot about pulling with the hip, but first we have to get to a position of power to where we can use the hip, and then we can pull with it.